Hello and welcome back to my channel. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Shan. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos. There are loads of different types of video on my channel. I'm sure you will find something that you like. I have for you what I read in February, and February was a very good reading month, which surprised me. I think largely because we went to Disneyland Paris, I'll leave a link here, and we went on the train. So I basically had near enough 8 hours on trains to and from where we live to read, and children just sat and chilled out so I could just sit and read. It was such a wonderful way to travel because you could get up and walk around, sit down, read a book, have a cup of tea, didn't need to worry about driving anywhere or catching a plane or taking off in the air, all of that stuff. So February has been a very good reading month. I'm going to start with the first book that I read, and that was Philip Pullman's Northern Lights. This is the first in the trilogy of his Dark Materials, and so many people have recommended that I read this book. I think partly because I was brought up in Oxford, so I can kind of visualise parts of the book far more easily than if you hadn't been there, but also because it's very much the kind of book that I like. So this was my first book and I absolutely loved it. It's set in a different type of world, and the book introduces you to a girl called Lyra, and all the people there have demon animals which are kind of live on their shoulders, and whilst they're children the demon animals can change to all sorts of different shapes, and when they become adults their demon changes into one specific shape. And it follows the story of Lyra. She's been brought up in Oxford. She's always told that her mum and dad had died when she was younger, so she knows she has an uncle, and other than that she's kind of quite a feral child. She's free to roam the streets of Oxford, free to go down to Jericho, and there are lots of gypsies who live down in Jericho, and she plays around with them as well. Then children start to go missing, including one of Lyra's very close friends, and word gets out that these people that are taking them are called the Gobblers. That's because people initially believe that they're eating the children, but Lyra wants to find her friend, so she sets out on this kind of epic adventure all across the north. And I can't really give too much away, but it is such an amazing fantasy world that Philip Pullman takes you into. It's so well written, and although I found it kind of difficult to get into, probably the first 2 chapters, I was just like, oh, what is this? But after those 2 chapters, I was just fully immersed into this world, and I loved it, and I didn't want to come back out of that world, and I can't wait to read the second in the trilogy. The next book I read this month is called The Secret of Nightingale Wood, and that is by Lucy Strange. I read this one as part of the Bookish Mamas book club, which is on Facebook. Again, I'll leave a link in the down bar to it. I think I left you one last month as well. So this was the book to read in February, and what I didn't appreciate when I first started reading it was that it is a children's book. So kind of, I don't know, I think they say 10+-ish on Amazon. And I think possibly I would have read it differently had I known it was a child's book. It's set in 1919 and the main character is a girl called Henrietta. And very early on you discover that Henrietta's brother died, and Henrietta's mum is poorly. She's clearly suffering for some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, some sort of depression, something like that. It's very clear that she is ill. Henrietta is known as Henry, and she has a nanny as well who lives with them, and also a cook, and they've moved to this new house because of clearly something that's happened at the old house. And her father takes a job in a different country. He clearly can't kind of deal with what's going on, so he just leaves, leaving Henry and the nanny and the cook to try and work through things. And although I found the plot of this book to be incredibly obvious, I think that's clearly because it's aimed at people far younger than me. And it basically follows the tale of GP trying to help, possibly trying to help, but ending up being a very, very scary character, and people kind of coming back from the dead. It's a very interesting book. I enjoyed reading it. There's a lot going on in it. And it's a nice enough tale. It was fairly obvious, a lot of the plot, and I could kind of see most of the things coming, if not all. but I did enjoy reading it, and it only took me kind of a couple of hours to read it. This was just on one of the trains that we got on. So read it if you like to. Read it if you'd like to. It's not one I'd definitely say go out and buy it, but it was perfectly enjoyable. Now, the third book I read is called Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng, and I read her book last month. I'll leave a link here to my review from January. I read Small Fires Everywhere and fell in love with it in a way I haven't fallen in love with a book in a little while, but I adored it. It was the kind of book I could not put down. So I was really excited to read this book. This was Celeste Ng's first book, and it follows the story of a Chinese-American family who are a couple, one of whom is white and one of whom is Chinese, and it's set in the 1970s when this wasn't particularly acceptable, if at all acceptable, in America where they're living. And it's a book which grapples with kind of racism, belonging, culture, all kinds of different things. Although the dad is Chinese, he's been brought up in the US, so to all intents and purposes he is American. Everything about him is American except for kind of what he looks like, but he was also a professor of American history, so like cowboys and Indians essentially, in the university, which I think people find rather odd, so to speak. And that's where his wife meets him. She's a student and he was a very young professor at the time. And it tells a tale of how these two people fall in love and have children, and the battle that both parents go through, but largely the dad, about whether or not those children will ever fit in because they are not the same colour as other people. Their daughter tragically dies, and they have another daughter as well and a son. And it's an incredibly moving book which takes into account all of the kind of social aspects of it, friendships, how other people treat the family, what happens to the family as they kind of crumble with what had happened to their daughter. You know, it's quite a harrowing tale, but it's an intense book, and it's intense in kind of a way where it looks at cultures and looks at aspects of humanity, which is very, very intriguing. I really enjoyed this book. It was totally different to her other book, Small Fires Everywhere, but I definitely enjoyed it, and it was another one that I really didn't want to put down. So I would definitely recommend this one this month. The fourth book I read this month is called The Keeper of Lost Things by Ruth Hogan. And as I've said in a previous video, I totally judge a book by its cover. I'm not ashamed of that. But literally only a book by its cover. I don't judge other things by their cover, but books, yes. And I bought this book because of the cover, because I loved it. It is about a man called Anthony Perdue who has spent his life collecting lost things and cataloguing them all, where he found them, what day it was, time, all of that kind of stuff. And it might just be something like a little hair bubble or, you know, something like that, but it could be one of the biggest things is someone's ashes that he found. So there's all kinds of things, and Anthony is a writer and he has an assistant who helps him in his house but also with his work, all this kind of stuff. Anthony is old and his assistant Laura kind of has had a bit of a tough life. She married a man she probably shouldn't have and isn't particularly happy with her life as it is now. When Anthony dies, he leaves the house to Laura, but he leaves it saying that she has to return all these lost things to people. And not necessarily that they all have to go back to the people, but that she has to try and find these people, which seems like a ridiculous task. It follows her journey trying to rediscover herself, but also trying to find the people whose items these are. And it's a good book. The plot line is quite obvious at times, and the story is quite obvious at times as well. But I quite liked how it all tied together, and although I probably wouldn't read it again, I wouldn't say don't buy it. So I enjoyed it enough that I would say go buy it. The final and fifth book I read this month is called Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. I hope I've said that right. And this was part of the Mumsnet book club, and I will leave a link down below to that book club. This is set in Nigeria, and it's about a lady called Yejade and her husband Akin. And Yejade is desperate for a child. Her and Akin met at university and fell in love absolutely, you know, the kind of love where you just see someone across the room and you know you want to be with them, that kind of all-consuming love. And yet they haven't been able to have children. And your JD's mother-in-law is very superstitious and takes your JD to all these kind of places to try and cure her so that she will be able to have children. And I don't want to give too much away about this book, but it was a book which I found incredibly moving, incredibly harrowing. It covers love and loss, and eventually your JD does get pregnant, but it doesn't all go smoothly, basically, is all I'm going to say. Turns out that she has a sickle cell gene, so her children have sickle cell. And it's a book about female spirit. It's a book about the patriarchy and how civilization in Nigeria at that time had these kind of specific roles for people. It's also quite political. There's a political uprising, political uncertainty, and that is covered really, really well in the book because you don't really notice it happening, but at the same time you realise that you've taken in all that kind of knowledge about how volatile the situation is. Like, they have armed robbers who send them a note to say, by the way, we will come and rob you at some point in the future. Get your money ready, basically. And, you know, it's a very volatile situation, and it's volatile both at home and politically. And Akin gets a second wife, not because he wants to, but because his mother kind of forces him to, because she believes that he will get her pregnant, so that at least they'll be able to have a child. And yeah, it's an incredible book. I'm explaining it really badly, but I would definitely recommend reading it. It is such an uplifting book, but in a harrowing way, if that makes any sense whatsoever, which it probably doesn't. Right, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've read lots of interesting and very different books this month, which feels like quite an achievement. So I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, give us a thumbs up. If you would like to, then please subscribe, and I will see you again soon. All right, bye.